The letter arrived on a Tuesday, which was the kind of ordinary detail that made what followed feel all the more surreal. Philippa Stanhope. No, that name was taken. Let me think clearly. The oil lamp in the corner of the estate office at Harrowfield had been burning since 7:30 in the morning, which meant the wick was already low by the time. Celia Brandt arrived with her satchel, her 3 reference volumes on estate law, and the quiet, self-contained manner that had made her, at 26, one of the few women in the county actually trusted to manage the financial records of a failing landed estate. Harrowfield itself was a study in what happened when pride outlasted money. The main house had 32 rooms, a long gallery with water stains along the cornice, and a stable block that still smelled of horses, though the last of them had been sold 2 winters ago. The grounds were beautiful in the way that neglected things sometimes were, wildly, accidentally, without any intention of being admired. The Viscount of Harrowfield, one Callum Aldrich, had inherited all of it 18 months ago upon the sudden death of his uncle, along with a tangle of debt so complex that 3 different solicitors had already declined to touch it. Celia had not declined. She had come recommended by her father's former associate, a solicitor in York, who had described her with the slightly surprised tone men always used when forced to admit a woman was competent. She has an uncommon head for figures, he had written, and an admirable reluctance to be told what she ought to find. The Viscount had read the letter and hired her without an interview. He was, she had gathered in the 6 weeks since her arrival, a man who moved at great speed through things he found uncomfortable, which was most things. He had nodded at her across the entrance hall on her first day, said something about the records being in the East Wing in a condition he could only describe as chaotic, and then left for Edinburgh, where he apparently had business of some variety that was never quite specified. She had not minded. The chaos was real. 18 months of neglected correspondence, unpaid invoices, and a filing system that appeared to have been organized, at some point in the previous century, by someone with a fondness for leather folders and a complete indifference to chronology. She had set about it the way her father had taught her, to set about anything overwhelming. One corner at a time, with patience and without complaint. It was in the 3rd week that she found the first anomaly. A payment record dated 6 years back for drainage work on the North Fields. The sum was significant, substantial enough to have genuinely improved the land had any such work been done, but the tenancy ledger for the same year showed the Northfield families, the Munros, the Keatings, old Braddock and his sons, paying rents that had been quietly increased to account for the improvements. She had set that ledger aside. She told herself it was a single discrepancy. Old estates had unusual accounting. She would keep it in mind. By the 5th week, she had 17 such records. The previous Viscount, Callum's uncle, the late Rowan Aldrich, a man whose portrait in the long gallery showed someone with kind eyes and a benevolent expression, had, over the course of nearly 15 years, been collecting from his tenants for improvements that were never made. Roads, resurfaced on paper, never on the ground. Fencing repaired in the ledger, still rotting in the east pasture. A new mill, invoiced in full, entirely absent from the land. It was not carelessness. The records were too consistent for that, too careful. The false invoices made out to contractors whose names appeared nowhere in the county records, whose addresses resolved to vacant lots in Leeds and Manchester. This had required effort. This had required intent. Celia sat very still for a long time after she understood what she was looking at. The tenants whose rents had funded phantom improvements were still here. She had seen them, Mrs. Munro, who brought eggs to the kitchen door on Thursdays, and whose husband had a cough that had worsened every winter for 3 years. Because the Northfield cottage still had no proper drainage. Young Keating, who was 23 and had inherited his father's lease along with the damp and the crumbling wall that the estate had been promising to repair since before the boy could read. She thought of her own father, who had been a decent man ruined not by his own choices, but by a landlord's decision to revalue the living attached to his parish out from under him. She knew what it was to watch someone absorb injustice, without a language for it, without a name for what had been taken. She had a name for it now. It was theft. Methodical, documented, repeated, dressed in the language of improvement and stewardship. The question was what to do about it. She thought about it for 4 days. She walked the grounds in the evenings, past the broken fencing and the unmended lane, and she thought. She was not employed to audit the previous Viscount's conduct. She was employed to organize the current one's records, to help Lord Aldrich understand his financial position well enough to make decisions about the estate's future. That was the scope of her work, as he had defined it in the letter of engagement. But the definition of a record was that it told the truth, and she could not organize a set of records around a lie, as though the lie were part of the foundation. Her father had been a clergyman. He had told her, more than once, that integrity was not a thing you stored. It was a thing you either spent or you didn't. She began to compile a summary. She worked carefully, methodically, cross-referencing each false invoice with the corresponding tenant payment, the corresponding rent increase, and the corresponding absence of any actual improvement. She drew the connections in plain language on clean paper, with page numbers and dates and ledger references, so that any reasonably intelligent person could follow it without assistance. It took her 8 evenings. When she was done, she held the pages in her hands and felt something she recognized as fear, though it was a quiet kind, the kind that did not shake her hands. She sent a note to Lord Aldrich's Edinburgh address, requesting an appointment on estate matters. His reply arrived 3 days later. He would be back at Harrowfield at the end of the week. She could see him Saturday morning. Saturday arrived grey and cold. There had been frost overnight, and the lawns were silver and stiff in the early light. Celia dressed simply as she always did, pinned her hair without fuss, and carried her folder of documents to the estate office, where Lord Aldrich had said he would receive her. He was already there when she arrived, which she had not expected. He was standing at the window, with a cup of tea going cold in his hand, looking out at the frost-pale grounds. He was taller than she remembered, or perhaps she had simply not looked at him directly before. He had dark hair and a face that might have been called handsome if it were not set in such permanent lines of strain, the kind that came from months of absorbing bad news and bracing for more. He turned when she entered. "You said it was a matter of some importance," he said. He did not sound unwelcoming, only tired. "It is," she said. She walked to the desk and set her folder on its surface. She did not sit. She did not think she would be here long enough for sitting to be useful. It concerns the estate records from the past 15 years, and specifically your uncle's accounting practices. Something changed in his expression. Not alarm, exactly. A kind of careful stillness. She spoke for perhaps 12 minutes. She had planned what she would say, and she said it, without embellishment, without softening, and without looking away from his face. She explained the pattern. She explained what it meant. She explained that the tenants of Harrowfield had been paying for improvements to their land that were never delivered, and that the sums involved, compounded over 15 years, were not negligible. When she finished, she opened the folder and placed the summary on the desk in front of him. He looked at it. Then he looked at her, Miss Brandt. His voice was even. "You have been here 6 weeks. 7, she said. As of yesterday. A faint something crossed his face. not quite acknowledgement. "You have been here 7 weeks," he said, "and in that time you have apparently decided that my uncle, a man who was born in this house, who managed this estate for 30 years, who was by all accounts respected and trusted by everyone who knew him, was engaged in deliberate fraud. The evidence is in those pages," she said. "I would not have brought it to you if I were not certain." "You are a filing clerk," he said. His voice had not risen, which somehow made it worse. "You were hired to organize the records, not to analyze them, not to form conclusions, not to bring accusations against a man's memory who cannot defend himself." "I am an estate records manager," she said, with the same quiet precision she might have used to correct a column of figures, "and my professional duty is to the accuracy of the record. These records are not accurate. They reflect transactions that did not occur." He stood up. The movement was controlled, but she could see the effort in it. "What you are describing," he said, "is impossible. My uncle was not a cruel man. He was not the kind of man who would do what you are suggesting. And I will tell you frankly, Miss Brandt, that I find it troubling that a woman in your position, with your access to private documents, has chosen to come to me with this rather than—" He paused. "Rather than what?" she asked. He did not finish the sentence. That was almost worse than finishing it. The implication was clear enough. She had heard its shape before, in different rooms, from different men. The suggestions that a woman who uncovered something inconvenient must have reasons for doing so that were not entirely professional. "I have no interest," she said, "in anything this estate could offer me beyond the salary I was contracted to receive. I brought this to you because it was the right thing to do, and because the people living on this land deserve to have someone in this house acknowledge what was taken from them." He turned away from her, went back to the window. His hands were on the sill. "Your employment here," he said, without turning around, "is concluded. I would ask you to be gone by Monday." She looked at his back, the straight, rigid line of it. Then she looked at the folder of documents on the desk. She had made a copy. The copy was in her room, inside her father's annotated copy of Blackstone's Commentaries on the Laws of England, where no one would think to look for it, she said, very quietly. "As you wish, Lord Aldrich." She picked up her satchel. She left the folder on the desk. And she walked out of the estate office, down the corridor, with its faded runner and its 2 large paintings, and out through the side door into the cold grey morning. She did not allow herself to feel it until she was past the kitchen garden wall and out of sight of the house. Then she stood for a moment with her face turned up to the sky, breathing the frost-edged air, and let herself be aware of the full weight of what had just happened. She had told the truth. He had not wanted it. She was not surprised. She was not even particularly angry. What she felt, more than anything, was tired, the particular weariness of a person who has done the correct thing and been penalized for it, not for the first time. She went back to her room and finished her packing. There was not much: her books, her papers, 3 dresses, a small watercolor of the Yorkshire moors that had belonged to her mother. She was done by mid-afternoon. Mrs. Holt, the housekeeper, found her in the corridor with her trunk and her satchel, and the flat expression of a woman who was not going to make a scene. "You've not been given your week's notice pay," the housekeeper said. "It was not a question. It was not discussed," Celia said. Mrs. Holt looked at her steadily. She was a woman of 60 or so, with the kind of face that had seen a great deal, and formed quiet opinions about all of it. She reached into her apron pocket and pressed 3 coins into Celia's hand. From the household account, she said, it was owed. Celia looked at the coins. She thought, suddenly and absurdly, that she might cry, which would have been very inconvenient. "Thank you," she said. She arranged for her trunk to be collected by the carrier on Monday, as Lord Aldrich had requested. She herself would take the Sunday coach from the village, which left at 8:30 in the morning. She walked to the village in the dark of early Sunday morning, her satchel over one shoulder and her father's Blackstone under her arm. The lane was cold and very quiet, just the sound of her boots on the frozen mud, and, somewhere far off, a single rook calling. The sky was beginning to pale at its edges, a gradual lightening from black to a deep, uncertain blue. She was perhaps 20 minutes into the walk when she heard footsteps behind her coming fast. She did not turn immediately. Footsteps in a country lane at dawn could be anyone. A farmhand going out early. A boy sent on some errand. She kept walking. The footsteps slowed behind her. Miss Brandt. She turned then. Callum Aldrich was perhaps 15 feet away, coatless in the cold morning, his breath coming in visible plumes. He had clearly come from the house in some urgency. His hair was disordered. He was holding her folder, her original folder. In one hand, his grip on it was not casual. He stopped when she turned. They looked at each other. His face was not the same as it had been in the office yesterday morning. The controlled, defensive anger was gone. What was there instead was harder to read, something scraped raw, something that had been arrived at through a long night and showed it. "You went through the ledgers," he said. His voice was different, quieter. "I went through them as well, last night." She waited. He held up the folder, the invoices, the contractor names. "I wrote to my solicitor at 11:30 last night and asked him to verify the addresses. He replied at 6 this morning." He swallowed. None of them exist. None of the contractors ever existed. She had known this. She had verified it herself 2 weeks ago, but she said nothing because he needed to finish. He looked at the folder in his hand. Then he looked at her. "I said things to you yesterday," he said, "that were." He stopped, started again. "I accused you of something. I did not say it plainly, but I implied it and you understood me. I know that you understood me." "Yes," she said. It was unjust. His jaw was tight, but his eyes were steady on her face. "You came to me with a truth I did not want, and I responded as though the problem was your character rather than the facts. That was wrong. I am telling you it was wrong." It was a different thing from an apology. It was more precise than an apology. It was an acknowledgement which was rarer and cost more. She said, "I know what the ledgers say, Lord Aldrich. I know it is not easy to receive." He nodded once. Then, he said, "Will you come back?" She looked at him. "Not to continue in the same capacity," he said quickly, as if he had already thought about how this would sound. "Not as." "I understand that is not." He stopped again. He seemed, for a moment, genuinely uncertain how to proceed, which was not a quality she would previously have attributed to him. "What I mean is that there is work to do. Real work. If even a portion of what is in those records is accurate, and I believe it is accurate, then there are people on this estate who are owed an accounting. An honest accounting. And I do not know how to do it without someone who already understands the records." He paused. "Someone who will tell me what is actually there, rather than what I would prefer to see. The coach would be in the village in 20 minutes. She thought of Mrs. Munro and her Thursday eggs. She thought of young Keating and the crumbling wall. She thought of the Northfield cottage and the drainage that had been paid for and never dug. She said, "You will have to look at all of it. There are more records than what I gave you. The full picture is worse." "I understand," he said. "And the tenants will need to be told," she said, directly, not through a letter from a solicitor. "You will need to stand in front of them and say it." Something moved through his expression. Not refusal, something like the recognition that this was going to cost considerably more than he had thought, and the choice, visible and real, to pay it anyway. "Yes," he said. She looked at him for a moment longer. Then she shifted her satchel on her shoulder. "I will need the East Office," she said, "and proper lamp oil. The supply has been inadequate since I arrived." He exhaled. It was not quite a laugh, but it was adjacent to one, the kind of sound a person made when something very tightly wound in them had just slightly loosened. "I will see to it," he said. They walked back to the house together, not quite side by side, still separated by the careful distance of two people, who were not yet sure what they were to each other. The frost on the lane crunched under their feet. The sky was full of pale early light, and the rooks in the far oaks had begun their ragged morning conversation. The weeks that followed were unlike anything Celia had experienced in 4 years of professional work. She had expected Lord Aldrich. Callum, as she eventually, reluctantly, began to think of him, though she did not use his name aloud for some time to manage this from a distance, to receive her reports and make decisions, and let her do the uncomfortable parts. He did not do this. He sat at the second desk in the East office for hours at a stretch. He asked questions that were at first defensive and then, as the days went on, increasingly genuine. He wanted to understand not just the numbers, but the mechanism. How it had been possible, what had made it so easy to conceal, whether the steward had known or had himself been deceived. She answered all of it. It was strange work, explaining a man's sins to his only surviving family member. She tried to be accurate without being gratuitously unkind. It was a narrow line to walk, and she walked it carefully. The steward, it turned out, had not known. He had been too trusting and too distant from the specific invoicing to have caught the pattern. He came in one morning, having somehow heard that something was being investigated, and stood in the doorway of the East office looking 10 years older than he had the week before. Callum stood up and told him directly what had been found, and that there was no evidence of the steward's involvement, and that his position was secure. The old man sat down heavily in a chair and said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, "I never thought to question the invoices. He was the Viscount. Why would I question the Viscount?" It was not a question. It was the sound of a man who had trusted something and could not yet decide whether he was foolish for having done so. Celia thought about that for a long time afterward. There was the matter of the sales. Callum owned, in addition to the estate, a townhouse in Edinburgh that he used perhaps 6 weeks a year, a collection of sporting paintings in the attic that had been his uncle's, and various other personal assets that were technically outside the entail. He sold them without visible hesitation, though she could see, once or twice, the slight tightening of his face when a particular figure came in lower than hoped. She did not comment on it. It was not her place, and in any case he had not asked for her sympathy. He had asked for accurate figures, which she continued to provide. The conversations with the tenants were the hardest. Callum had asked her to accompany him to each cottage, as she had known he would eventually ask, because the tenants had seen her on the grounds for weeks and knew she was connected to whatever was happening, and because her presence was a kind of guarantee, the visible fact of a woman who was not part of the Aldrich family, and therefore had no reason to soften the truth. At the Munro cottage, Mrs. Munro sat very still through Callum's explanation, and then, when he finished, asked him to repeat the amount. The figure for what her family had paid toward improvements never made. He repeated it. She stared at the table for a long moment. Then she said, "My husband died in that field. The drainage, he was told, was coming. He died waiting for it." The silence after that lasted a long time. Callum said, "I know, I am sorry. I cannot give you back what was taken. I can only tell you the truth and begin to make the rest right." Mrs. Munro did not say that this was enough. Celia did not think it was enough either, but the old woman nodded once, and that had to do. The Keatings received them with suspicion, and eventually with a kind of exhausted relief. Young Keating shook Callum's hand at the end, and then immediately looked as though he was not sure why he had done it. They did not ask for anything beyond the confirmation, in writing of the new fair lease which Celia had prepared in advance and handed over without ceremony. 2 of the tenants refused to see them at all. One of them, a man in his 60s who had known the late Viscount personally, sent word that he wanted nothing from the house, not money, not apology, not conversation. Celia respected this. Some wounds did not resolve into receipts. Somewhere in the middle of all of it, the formality between them changed. It was not a sudden thing. It happened the way the light changed in the evenings, gradually, imperceptibly, until she looked up one night from a column of figures and realized that the atmosphere in the East office was not Fivers, was not the same as it had been a month ago. He had begun to ask her opinion on things beyond the records, not just what the numbers said, but what she thought ought to be done with the information. She had begun to offer the opinion without waiting for the explicit invitation, because she had noticed that he received it better when it came directly. They ate their meals in the small dining room, the 2 of them and Mrs. Holt, who joined them without ceremony after the 2nd week, and whose presence had the useful effect of making the whole arrangement feel less peculiar. She saw, in those evenings, a person she had not expected. He was not warm, exactly, in the way that some people were warm, open, and easy, and quick to laugh, but he had a dry, careful humor that appeared without warning. Usually when he was most tired, and it was funnier for being so precisely deployed. He spoke about the land with a kind of unsentimental love, the love of someone who understood its problems and chose it anyway. He asked about her father. He asked about the years before Harrowfield. He listened to the answers in a way that suggested he was actually retaining them. She was careful. She had spent a lifetime being careful in other people's spaces, occupying the useful corners. She had learned not to mistake proximity for belonging. But something was happening quietly in the East office and the small dining room, and she was aware of it the way one was aware of a change in the weather before it quite arrived. The night the last of the formal restitution documents was signed and witnessed, Callum set down his pen and looked at the desk for a moment without speaking. Then he said, "That's done, then." "The first part of it," she said. He looked at her. There was something in his face she had not seen before, or had seen, and not named. Something that was not quite relief and not quite hope, and was perhaps both of them together. "What comes next," he said, "is different. The estate can function honestly on what remains. It will be small. It will not be what it was, but it can be real." "Yes," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "You could stay," he said. "Not as," he stopped. He looked at his hands. He was not, she had learned, a man who found this kind of thing easy. He was a man who had spent the better part of a year being alone with very bad news, and solitude had made him precise and careful in all the ways that mattered, and awkward in this one. "You have been honest with me," he said finally, "in a way that no one else has been in a very long time, and I find that I have become—" He stopped again. She waited. "I find that I cannot picture the East office without you in it," he said, which is a peculiar thing to say. "I am aware of that." She looked at him. The lamp was low. The fire had burned to a warm, steady ember. Outside, the grounds of Harrowfield were dark and quiet, and somewhere in the night, the rooks were settled in their oaks. She thought of what she had believed, coming here, that this was temporary work, a post like any other, useful and limited. She had not expected to find a place that felt, in some difficult-to-articulate way, like it had been waiting for someone to tell it the truth. She had not expected him. "I am not interested in the East office," she said. He looked up. "I am interested in Harrowfield," she said carefully, meaning to be precise, "in the land and the work, and," she paused, "and in what you are trying to build here. If that is what you are asking, it is what I am asking," he said. He was very still. He was also, she noticed, not breathing particularly steadily. "Are you saying yes?" she said. "I am saying yes," he exhaled. And there it was, the thing that happened to his face when some tightly held piece of him released, not quite a smile. Almost. The beginning of one, which was in some ways better. He reached across the desk and placed his hand over hers. The gesture was careful and deliberate, and said a great deal more than either of them had managed yet with words. She turned her hand over and returned the pressure, which said the rest. A year later, the East Office at Harrowfield had a second window. Callum had arranged for it during the summer, without mentioning it in advance, on the grounds that the original single window had been genuinely inadequate for two people working at adjacent desks. He had said this in a tone suggesting it was a purely practical decision. She had thanked him in a tone suggesting she knew perfectly well it wasn't. The grounds were recovering, slowly, imperfectly, in the way that real things recovered. The North Field drainage had been completed in September. Actual drainage this time, dug by actual men hired through an actual contractor, whose address resolved to a real building on a real street in Leeds. Mrs. Munro had come to see the work when it was finished and stood for a long time without speaking. Celia had stood beside her. The late Viscount's portrait still hung in the long gallery. They had discussed once whether to take it down. In the end, they had left it, for the same reason you left a scar, because removing it did not change what had caused it, and because occasionally it was useful to remember. Young Keating had repaired his own wall by then, not waiting for the estate to do it, which was fair enough. He had also improbably begun corresponding with a girl from the next village, and the tenancy register showed his lease renewed for another 10 years, at terms that were straightforwardly honest. On a Thursday in late November, Mrs. Munro brought eggs to the kitchen door, as she always did, and then came to the East Office door, which was open, and knocked on the frame. Celia looked up from the register she was updating. A real register, a new one, recording the actual work done on the land each month, the small daily evidence of a place that was healing. Callum was at his desk. He had been reading correspondence from a neighbouring estate, a younger man who'd inherited a similarly tangled situation and had somehow heard there was a Viscount in the north who had found a way through it. Mrs. Munro said, "My daughter is getting married in the spring." She and Callum both looked up. The old woman's expression was not quite warm and not quite cold and was very much her own. She was looking at Celia when she spoke. "We would be glad," she said, "if you would come." After she left, the East Office was quiet for a moment. Callum said, without looking up from his papers. "You should go." "I intend to," Celia said. He glanced across at her then, that almost smile. The one she had stopped, trying to predict, and simply waited for, because it was always worth waiting for. Outside, the November light was low and level across the frost-pale fields and in the long grass at the edge of the North Meadow, where the new drainage channels had been cut in September. The first green shoots of winter rye were coming in.